one more thing. I was going to try something today around closed captioning. So PowerPoint has the ability now to close caption and translate. So you should be able to see the Spanish translation to my presentation and what I'm saying at the bottom of the screen. If you also have closed captions, you might have to move that box to a separate space on your screen. So this is new, just trying it out today. I was going to try it out at the conference, and then I completely forgot to do it. And because we're recording it, then when we record it and post it to YouTube, cross my fingers, I hope we'll have both the ability to have your parents watch this if they, their first language is Spanish, and have it available in both languages in the closed captions. So the definition of migration is the movement of individuals, groups, or animals from one location to the other. And I just loved this mural. I reached out to the muralist and she gave me permission to use it. And just the symbolism of the monarch. The monarch butterfly has come to symbolize the migration experience. It naturally migrates to North America and back to its homeland in Mexico. It adapts and it transforms and may take multiple generations to complete the journey, and symbolically returns during Dia de los Muertos in time to commemorate those who came before them. And I feel like that's what we do. We carry our ancestors with us wherever we go. And I just love that the monarch is like our symbol of our community and of migrants specifically. There's a quote by Gael Garcia Bernal: "Migration is as natural as breathing, as eating, as sleeping. It is part of life and part of nature." The muralist on her website says, the mural depicts monarch butterflies and native Mexican Texan milkweed and reads, "Migration is beautiful" across the top. She says, through this mural, I hope to inspire reflection on what it means to migrate or have movement, free movement. I am confronting the contradictory associations the word migration tends to bring up. This is especially important here in Texas, where we are very much implicated in ongoing discussions regarding Central American migration into the United States, a source of great discord, and simultaneously in the direct migratory path of the monarch butterfly, something we openly celebrate even as we destroy the monarch's habitats. These contradictions hit at the root of our problematic anthropocentric relationship with the natural world, as well as a need to engage more wholly with ideas of coexistence, symbiosis, and kindness in the modern world. On the map, the dots represent where monarch butterflies have been observed and the migration path they need to take to return home to Mexico. This artist, Fabiana Rodriguez, and this is a first, I was not able to show this butterfly at the conference because I hadn't reached out to the artist, but I reached out to her today with her permission to show this beautiful butterfly. Fabiana Rodriguez says, monarch butterflies migrate freely across the Americas in search of safer habitats. The human profile in each of the butterfly's wings highlights the courage and resiliency of people who, like the monarch butterfly, migrate across human-made political borders. The phrase "migration is beautiful" honors those who cross borders in search of safety and the chance to pursue their dreams. Migration is communal and it's natural. Native peoples left an indelible imprint on the land with systems of roads that tied nations and communities together across the entire landmass of the Americas. This is America. These are the paths and trails that the indigenous peoples, native peoples that lived here for thousands of years created and built, connecting their communities. These trail systems were not just for migration, but they were for trading. So much so that they formed trail systems and roadways throughout the Americas, east and west, north and south through Mexico. These trailways, our roadways, were used for short and long distance travel along the Pacific coast and along the rivers. They formed a network of indigenous nations based on advanced agriculture, and early pioneers and colonial explorers relied on the local indigenous guides and path knowledge. However, they didn't give them credit. They frequently claimed these trails as new discoveries or pioneer roads without adequately crediting the original native engineers. I also tried to cite where I did the research for the information on this presentation. So here I show the book as well as the links. And again, you can have a copy of the slide deck that will include all of the links to all of my sources. This is a map from the Library of Congress called National Atlas, Indian Tribes, Cultures, and Languages. You cannot talk about migration without talking about language. Hundreds of languages were spoken throughout the Americas. This is just the US. The continent was richly populated with Native American communities. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in a wide range of environments, from shore to shore, each community or nation with its own distinct culture. Imagine how many languages. But in the centuries that followed, the arrival of Europeans after 1492 were years of tremendous loss from disease, starvation, and bloodshed, all driven by relentless expansion of U.S. settlements. Then in 1619 is the arrival of the first pirate ship carrying 20 enslaved Africans, which now expands migration to forced migration or forced displacement, which is not natural and not voluntary. While migration is the regular movement of individuals or groups from one location to another, and migration is natural, forced migration is a different story. Forced migration is not voluntary and it is not natural. There is someone or something forcing them to migrate. And these are just a few examples. The indigenous displacement of Native Americans. One example is the Trail of Tears. The millions of African people who were kidnapped and enslaved. The forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. The mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. The Great Migration, the relocation of 6 million Black Americans escaping systemic racial violence. Asylees and refugees who were fleeing war and violence. And we can't forget the Hawaiian and Puerto Rican diaspora. All to clarify what the difference is between migration and immigration. Migration is natural. Immigration is a system. U.S. immigration system decides who belongs and who does not belong. Like this quote, where community is to be formed, common memory must be created, by George Erasmus, an Aboriginal leader from Canada. In Justice Whitener's keynote on the first day of the conference, she said, "We need to remember. We need stories of remembrance." And I really feel that that's what this presentation is today. We're going to remember. We need our history so that we don't repeat it. It doesn't repeat itself, and to also recognize when it is repeating itself. Migration stops or is limited when borders and laws are created that codify who belongs and who does not belong, who is included and who is excluded. Many say that our immigration system is broken. Or is it working as designed? Let's take a trip down memory lane and find out. This is a high-level overview of the history of our immigration system, all the way back to 1776. We have codified who is included and who is excluded. We created an immigration system that was clearly designed with a specific national identity in mind. All the yellow boxes are immigration laws that were written to exclude based on race, ethnicity, and nationality. The green boxes are immigration laws that expanded who was included. I'm not going to cover every single box, but give a high-level review of those impacting our community. And I did give a presentation a few months back on this portion, so I'm going to go through pretty fast, even though I've changed a lot of it. Starting with the Declaration of Independence. It proudly declares that all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, there's a contradiction. 1/5 of the population was enslaved. 1/3 of the signers, including Thomas Jefferson, were enslavers. A passage condemning the slave trade was removed from the final draft to appease Southern colonies. And through that silence, the Declaration affirms the enslavement of African people and makes it clear who was excluded from the very beginning. Thomas Jefferson quoted, "We have the wolf by the ear," talking about enslavement, "and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation is on the other." Self-preservation for who? The very first immigration law tells us. It is the Naturalization Act of 1790 that codified who belongs in the US and who is going to be considered a citizen. This is where we clearly see that not all men are created equal. Citizenship is restricted to free white people, specifically white male property owners. This act was not fully abolished until 1965. It's partially abolished in 1952. Think about that. What privileges does a citizen receive, and why does it matter? Because only citizens could vote, only citizens could own land, and only citizens had a voice because they were the only ones who could testify in court. In the first US Census, 3.9 million were categorized as free white people. 3/5 were slaves, enslaved, and it completely excluded Native Americans. And then we have the first anti-immigration law just 13 years later that bans the immigration of free Black people, because Haitians were free. And we were afraid free Haitians would try to immigrate to the US and cause problems regarding enslavement. And then it wasn't by accident that these laws were created, because what happens in the very same year in 1803? The Louisiana Purchase. We are now expanding westward. We have all of this land, and who is going to own this land? Citizens. And who are the citizens? Free white men. This sets the foundation for future immigration laws. A system created to support who will own land and who will do the labor. And where are we getting the land? But in the Louisiana Purchase, and then later we'll talk about how they came to get the rest of the land. Again, codified and established racial and social hierarchies that excluded Native Americans, African Americans, and non-white immigrants. In addition to women couldn't be citizens or indentured servants. This law set the foundation for future nationality laws, influencing future legislation. Birthright citizenship is also established for the children of said free white men. These racial restrictions were not eliminated until 1952 and 1965. And then more land that was stolen. We then enacted the Indian Removal Act in 1830 to remove Native Americans from their land through the Trail of Tears. In 1846, General Fremont then organized the Sacramento River Massacre and the beginning of settler violence and genocide of Native communities in California. But yet in 1846, the U.S. didn't own that land. They didn't own California yet. That didn't come till later. In 1829, Mexico abolishes slavery. And did you know the Underground Railroad went to Mexico because Mexico had already abolished slavery? The Battle of the Alamo, regardless of how they glorify it in the movies, it was about slavery and wanting to keep slavery on Texas land, which belonged to Mexico. And in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, with the U.S. finally gets the land, Mexico cedes the land to the U.S. and promises in this treaty citizenship, the ability to keep their language, civil rights, and their land to all of the Mexicans on that land. That land, get to that part, included California, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Mexico gives it all up and gave up all claims to Texas. And then that border that you see in the red, because look, Mexico owned all the land all the way to the California-Oregon border. All of that was Mexico. All of that area should be speaking Spanish. All of that area should still belong to the native Mexicans that were living on that land. And it gets moved to the Rio Grande River, where the border still is today. And something that you'll hear a lot of us say is the border crossed us, like my family. I come from a family of Tejanos. The border crossed us. We didn't cross the border. And then if you get the slide deck, because this is really in tiny print, it's very interesting that even with the Sacramento River Massacre in 1846, the way this map calls that massacre is number 5. It calls it the Fremont and Kearny Secure California. They don't call it a genocide. They don't call it a massacre. It says when they secured California, which was all done while it still belonged to Mexico. And what happens? The treaty is broken like the 300 treaties that came before it. Mexicans lose their ancestral ranch lands. Native Americans are completely excluded from the protections, as if they followed through on the protections anyway. And there is linguistic erasure, which we still see today. Anti-Mexican mob lynchings, which is why I blurred the photo because I didn't want it to re-traumatize or trigger any of us, but wanted you to see that there is evidence that this happened. And La Matanza, the Texas Rangers, their role was to kick us off our land. And they have, I hid the picture. These are 3 Texas Rangers smiling and posing with their lariats and the bodies of 3 Mexican men. Mexican-American men, implicated in police brutality, and what was known as Juan Crow, and the segregation with signs like "We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans allowed." Sam says, I recently read Race to the Truth, Borderlands, and the Mexican-American Story, and it was really excellent and heartbreaking history that I never learned. They talk in the book specifically about how learning our history was something that was taken from us so that we would be separated from our heritage and everything that comes with it. Yes. again with linguistic erasure. And my sisters were swatted in school for speaking Spanish in the playground. This was in the 70s. And while we acknowledge that Spanish is the language of our Spanish colonizer, that's still our native language and my first language. And so not only were our indigenous languages erased, our indigenous heritage, as you mentioned, Sam, we're disconnected from our indigenous tribes and our indigenous language, and now our language is being erased twice. And then I added this slide because, I mean, it aligns with Juneteenth. Texas was fighting so hard for slavery because the other thing that I didn't mention before is that the US, and I don't know what law it is exactly, had this law that was created that said any additional land that we gain as we move west will not have slavery. It will be outlawed on those lands that we're gaining. That included all of the land gained in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that treaty was in 1848. So slavery is abolished. It should not even exist as of 1848 on those lands. However, we're still fighting. The Civil War happens in 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and there's Jubilees, which were the celebrations of Emancipation Proclamation, but it wasn't until June 19th of 1865, which we're celebrating this month, Juneteenth, that Texas, I say they knew, that Texas was finally forced to honor the law. That's 1865, when it really should have been illegal since 1848, because slavery had already been abolished on Mexican land. And then the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, when it's finally codified as an amendment. So that to highlight just our history and why I wanted it to include it, because this impacts who we are as a community and as a people. Further exclusion and inclusion in our immigration history is in 1875, the Page Act, and 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this is where it starts. This is where, you know, as far as laws go anyway, I'm sure it started way before that because we saw the Juan Crow laws, is exclusion and blaming of U.S. problems, poverty, economy on the immigrant. Before there was mass deportation, there was the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, because the Chinese had come to work. They had come to work. I mean, they were mining gold on the West. They came to work in the gold mines. And because of racism, a lot of them ended up becoming entrepreneurs, which they still are today. They also get blamed. After the economy slows down, they start blaming them for taking their jobs and decide to create a law that completely excludes Chinese from immigrating. This was in 1882. Yet, 10 years later, we open up Ellis Island. What happened to immigrants taking our jobs? Ellis Island is opened, which is now more European, and that they stay open from 1892 to 1943, where 20 million immigrants are processed through Ellis Island. Again, who is excluded and who is included? And then World War I happens, and there's a shortage. U.S. dependent and becomes dependent on Mexican agricultural labor. This is where we come in, 1914 to 1918. But then the Great Depression happens, and similar to the Chinese, Mexicans are blamed for low wages and job shortages. So in 1930, with the Great Depression, happens our first mass deportation. The U.S. economy collapses, and Mexican immigrants are now blamed, scapegoated for the lack of jobs. And through localized programs, federal coercion, an estimated 1 to 2 million people of Mexican descent including U.S. citizens, because it's never been about citizenship, were deported or pressured to relocate to Mexico. Because we were taking their jobs. Same language, same rhetoric that we hear today. Again, who is included and who is excluded? By the trainloads. This is a newspaper article that where 1,500 Mexicans were loaded on trains and deported. Then again, 1942 to 1964, there's the Bracero program, because there's another labor shortage. World War II. Japanese immigrants were doing a lot of the labor in the farms and the farmlands. And what happens to them? They're blamed for what happened with World War II, and they're sent to concentration camps and incarcerated and deported, and a mass deportation, maybe not out of country, but to these concentration camps, and there's lack of labor. So we create the Bracero program, and Braceros migrate to the Pacific Northwest. Now we see our Mexican communities coming to the Northwest. They were here even before that, but more so after the Bracero program. We have newspaper articles or Mexican recruiting Mexican workers wanted in October for jobs. And even a note from the Yakima Chamber of Commerce thanking Mexico's president for all of the workers and Braceros that came to Yakima to aid in harvesting vital foods grown in the area. Wartime labor. We filled the labor shortage, brought in millions of Mexican agricultural guest workers on short-term contracts, many of them mistreated because they really had no rights, only had their word, even though they signed contracts. Many of them were returned with no payment. Over 5 million braceros is the estimate that came from Mexico to work in the U.S. But they were treated poorly. And for a period, the Mexican government even refused to send any more because they heard about how poorly they were treated, and didn't end until 1964. But what happens again? Too many braceros taking everybody's jobs. So there is a second mass deportation. In 1954, 1.3 million deported, up to, again, 60% U.S. citizens, because we only go based on their skin color. You can't tell by looking at somebody what somebody's immigration status is. And why? Because now they're calling us an invasion. That rhetoric hasn't changed. Taking jobs and an invasion, contributing to crime and disease, displacing domestic laborers and veterans, lowering wages, and affecting working conditions. Does this rhetoric sound familiar? Thank you, Jovita, for mentioning that your father was a bracero. Again, who belongs? Who is included and who is excluded? Taken by train, taken by gun, by force, and nabbed and called derogatory names in our newspapers. So that's what it was called. It was called Operation Wetback. Blamed for the economy again. And again, there's a labor shortage. The very last immigration reform we had was in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act. In 1965, the immigration pathway for family reunification was created. And in punishment for employers and enhancing border security and granting amnesty was created in the 1986 Act. But the difference between the 1986 Act and the 1965 Act is that we had a new pathway in 1965. This is where we created this pathway for families to bring families. But in 1986, even though it's called immigration reform, there was no reform. It did provide amnesty to the many undocumented families that were living here because, again, they were feeling a need because we had labor shortages. So we acknowledged that by giving them amnesty and giving them documentation and a path to citizenship for them. But only them. There was no new path created for anybody coming after them. So really, there has been no immigration reform since 1965. That's 60 years. Yet, Here in the state of Washington, we have 15 million acres of farmland that produce 300 different crops, a $12.8 billion industry that requires 145,000 skilled farm workers during peak season, today, present day. And still 70% are born in another country. And yet the only documents or pathway right now for labor is the H-2A visa worker, which there was only 36,000 visas issued in 2025. And anybody who already has status from before. No new pathways have been created. So the undocumented labor force is the backbone of the fruit industry. De Loera, who represents the United Farm Workers Union, says the top priority must be to defend the jobs and expand the legal protections of existing farm worker population. They are not the criminals. The system has not been designed with them in mind, and to create a pathway for them to work with employment authorization. Karina Gallardo, a Wazoo professor of economics, says many of these workers who originally filled essential agricultural roles are aging out of the physically intensive work, while others who settled in the U.S. seek year-round, higher-paying jobs in other industries. This decline in available labor has created a stark imbalance as agricultural demands grow, especially with modern high-density planting techniques requiring more intensive care and requiring more skilled labor. These are skilled jobs. Don't let them tell you that it's unskilled. And yet, last time we created the Bracero program, and then there was reform. This time around, there is a labor shortage. And what do? We don't create another pathway. We have a third mass deportation, which reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's quote at the very beginning. But rather than talk about enslavement, it's talking. I hear it as if it's talking about immigration. We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation on the other. And again, I ask, self-preservation for who? The same rhetoric is being used. Dehumanization rhetoric that calls us all of these names, which I will not say out loud, even though I put them on the screen. Continuous rhetoric. An author that I read a lot, Kat Armas, says, stories form narratives, narratives form ideologies, and ideologies form systems. And that immigration system, that exclusion and inclusion clearly tells you who belongs, who doesn't belong. That is an example of systemic racism. Who is included based on our race and ethnicity? And then this rhetoric then becomes the narrative, and immigrants and migrants are blamed for the cost of housing, high crime, taking our jobs, and low wages, back to the very first mass deportation. And now what do we see? A system with no due process, racially profiled. The Supreme Court has made it perfectly legal to profile us by the way we look, the way we speak, and where we work. Families living in fear, military-style kidnappings, and inhumane detention centers at the systemic level. These aren't individuals doing these things. This is a system created to do these things because of the dehumanizing rhetoric and narratives that have been created about our community. And yet we still keep fighting. El pueblo unido nunca será vencido. Continuing to protest, continuing to fight for our communities, faith communities coming together, the United Farm Workers Union still coming together, still protesting. And here we see Dolores Huerta still protesting in her 90s. We continue to fight because I don't believe it has to do with our immigration status. I believe it's because they're afraid of our community. By 2060, it is expected that the Hispanic population will grow up to 119 million. Our median age for Hispanics is 31.2, while white Americans is 43.2. And something that leads us into our further conversation today is we've created a space of belonging. Aquí estamos y no nos vamos. If you look at this map, this is the census from 2020, which I'm sure it's, maybe there's more counties now. The green are counties that are majority Hispanic or Latino. We would expect that to be in the Southwest, the original location of the states that were seated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But look outside of the Southwest. There's only 3 counties in all of North America that are majority Hispanic, and that's in Washington State. Yakima, Adams, and Franklin counties. I'm proud of that color green up in that left corner. That means we've created community here. We're here to stay. We had families migrating from Texas and Arizona and California that decided to stay in Washington and make Washington home. And I believe this is what the systems are afraid of us being the majority. Which takes us to our story. What happened in Eastern Washington that caused us to stay? So what inspired me for this presentation today was I was on Facebook, I do the socials, and found a Facebook group where people were posting old pictures and trying to identify who was in this picture. Come to find out, these pictures belong to a photographer, Erwin Nash. So he has a collection that they've now gathered all these pictures and gave them to Washington State University. The link is also in my slide deck, where they have collected more than 10,000 pictures of Erwin Nash. And the collection is called Yakima Valley Migrant Labor from 1967 to 1976. And what drew Erwin Nash to come take pictures of our Yakima Valley and our people is his quote, "I don't like to see people suffer. And it's worse when they suffer because of racial and ethnic reasons." So the rest of my presentation are pictures. Beautiful pictures of our valley, beautiful pictures of our community. And yes, they were on display at the Yakima Museum and on display at Washington State University in Pullman. And if you missed both of those, which I did, I'm so sad, you get to see some of them here, and they are available online if you want to go and look at more of them. Spanning from 67 to 75, Nash captured over 10,000 black and white images of Yakima Valley's Latinx and Indigenous farm workers. His work documented our daily labor, the migrant camps, the rise of the agricultural labor movement, and the entire collection was digitized and available to you online at Washington State University. He highlighted our protest, advocacy, and justice. We've always advocated for our community, and I call this our beloved community. Another one of his quotes is, "From what I saw, they weren't being treated like human beings. They were treated like tools, almost like animals to help in the crops." And while I talked about labor and the need for labor, please don't mistake that to think that I think that's all we are. We are not. That's why I'm highlighting us as a community and as people. We are hard workers, but we are more than just labor and farm labor. We are more than just what we produce. We are human beings that deserve dignity and that have so much to offer our communities and the state of Washington. This is Guadalupe Gamboa on the left and Michael Fox on the right. He is an attorney clasping hands the morning after they were arrested for going into a labor camp to help farm workers organize for better living and working conditions. And those of you who know this history, whose families went through this history, have heard about the poor working conditions that our families worked under. On the bottom left is a picture, I believe this was from last year, if not a couple of years ago, of Guadalupe Gamboa sitting on the couch, Michael Fox standing above them, and Erwin Nash sitting on the couch next to Guadalupe Gamboa. Before those pictures, I also just want to give credit where credit is due. The civil rights movement birthed the Chicano movement. And while the Chicano movement started really in 1947, I believe, with the Mendez versus Westminster decision. I mean, this is how long we've been active in supporting our communities, advocating for our communities. This was the very first segregation law that passed that desegregated California. Was a Latino family from California, a Mexican family from California whose daughter was not allowed to attend public schools. They wanted her to attend the poor, segregated, no resource school, and they won. And that actually set a precedent for Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. After my presentation, and I'll include the links also in the slide deck, last week, somebody sent me a link of a park that has been developed in California to honor the Mendez versus Westminster decision. And then the decisions on the left, the events on the left, all really led to what the Chicano movement did at the national level around the Farmworkers Union, the grape strikes, the Brown Berets, the Chicano student movement, and why we were radicalized by the FBI and the assassination of Ruben Salazar in 1970. So I just wanted to just lay a picture of what was happening in our nation before focusing on what was happening in our valley. And this word Chicano came from that movement. It signaled a rejection of a Mexican-American identity that accepted assimilation and shunned their cultural roots. Chicano reflects their commitment to a new political consciousness, a self-respect and pride in our cultural background. So I identify as a Chicana. And a quick timeline of what was happening in the Washington State Chicano movement. Here you see in 1967, Tomás Villanueva. I love this picture of Tomás. Tomás and I actually worked together at DSHS later, before his retirement. But I just loved finding this old picture of a young Tomás behind a typewriter. And, you know, even when I was in his office, I still think that he still had that typewriter. I could have sworn he had a manual typewriter in his office. He co-founded the United Farm Worker Co-op in Toppenish, the first activist Chicano organization in the state of Washington. And then I just want to highlight that we are all in this together. Why I highlighted the civil rights movement. In the summer of 1968, the UW Black Student Union students traveled to the Yakima Valley to recruit the first major group of Chicanos in the at the University of Washington. That fall, they had prior to that fall, they had maybe somebody said 3 Latinos or Chicanos at UW. They recruited 30 to 35, the numbers differ on different sites, but at least 30 to 35 Chicano students from the Yakima Valley were the very first cohort that went as a group to the University of Washington because of the University of Washington Black Student Union. And from what I read about them, they held a protest and a sit-in at the dean's office requesting for funding and permission to come recruit Latinos in Eastern Washington. And that cohort of Latinos, Chicanos from Eastern Washington were really the foundation of the Chicano movement that I'm going to talk about in the next slides. From 68 to 70, there were the Brown Berets that came to the Yakima Valley and organized marches. It was a 5-mile march through town to protest the racist and insensitive practices of staff at the welfare office. DSHS, where I work today, in Yakima. DSHS did redeem themselves, though. They hired Tomás as a community worker to be in the community. And that's how I knew Tomás. Tomás and I would go on Spanish public radio and talk about DSHS programs. In 1973, African-American and Chicano students occupy a building at Yakima Valley College, demanding the establishment of an ethnic studies program and the hiring of Black and Chicano counselors. Then in 1979, Radio Cadena is established, and I'll talk about them a little bit later too, as a Spanish language public radio station in Granger to communicate with our community. And then in 1980, 20 Asian and Chicano University of Washington students occupied the office of the vice president, demanding an end to a new admissions program that was going to limit the number of minority and poor students and demanding his resignation. It takes all of our communities working together. So I love this photo of Dolores Huerta. She's protesting at the Safeway in Seattle in 1968. And then at the same time, I added this flyer because there's also, this flyer was for the Safeway in Sunnyside. And my imagination just pictures Tomás Villanueva at that manual typewriter typing this flyer out and then doing those mimeographs to copy it and hand out. As we were mobilizing, while Dolores was in Seattle, we were in Sunnyside, all protesting Safeway during the Delano grape boycott. And just love this picture of her on the left outside the Safeway, and then somebody must have gone inside the store and taken a picture of her through the window of her face and to be able to see what the sign said. And we were all participating. These are our mothers, tias, abuelitas. You know, this is in the late 60s, early 70s. Here we have 8 women stand together from a hop strike in the field near Mapton. I didn't know this history. Huelga, strike, por la raza toda, afuera de la raza nada. Sunnyside, Washington Farm Worker Union meeting at the Sunnyside Central Park in 1972. And here's Bill Nicasio, Vice President of the United Farm Workers in Washington State. His commitment, I saw some video interviews of him that I didn't have time to bring today, of the efforts that he made. His commitment to social justice, tireless efforts to improve the lives of farm workers have left a permanent mark all over Washington State. These are our ancestors who came before us that paved the road for us to be here today. I love this picture of El Teatro El Piojo. These were University of Washington students. The very first Chicano theater traveling show that went around doing these activist shows that showed history and what is happening, the issues facing our days. So it wasn't theater just for the sake of drama, but really also for the sake of education. And they called it El Teatro del Piojo. I thought that was really interesting. So did some research that they named it Piojo because Piojo is what they called us. It was a degrading stereotype, and they wanted to transform it into a name of and symbol of resilience. Because Anglo teachers would humiliate, and I remember this as a 6th grader in Idaho, by putting us in the front of the class, you know, escudriñando, how do they say that? Their hair for lice in front of the class. So they adopted that negative and turned it into a positive. And this troop was founded by no other than Tomás. Oh, I thought this was Tomás Villanueva. Sorry. Tomás Ibarra Frausto and Elda Cisneros, which I believe are the people on the guitars in the picture on the bottom right. Tomás Villanueva comes on another side. And they call themselves the cultural arm of El Movimiento, the Chicano movement. I love the picture on the left because I actually knew Tony. He's passed away. He was a friend of my husband's. His name was Tony Castañeda. He was actually a corrections officer, state employee. So just loved his smile in this picture. So the Chicano movement in Washington, they were out protesting, farm worker protests in Toppenish in 1970 on the top left. Farm worker children at a farm worker meeting in Zilla. And then Carlos Trevino at a protest. He was responsible for a lot of the work of Seymour Museum. Their sign says, Chale con this gringo war. The bottom one was Mecha and Brown Berets formed a large contingent in an anti-Vietnam War demonstration in the early 70s. I was part of Mecha at my university. And so all of this, again, can be found online on a timeline of the Movimiento, oral history interviews about the Chicano movement. I believe the sign on the top left that says, make cops pay for racist murder is in reference to the assassination of journalist Ruben Salazar in California. And our impact. So these pictures on this Facebook group, they've been posting pictures and people identifying certain pictures with the names of family members. And so where I could, I added the name of the family member to honor their family on the slide. So before I continue, we haven't had much engagement. Midterm meetings were fun. I know you showed or stated the city that you're connected to in Eastern Washington. I want you, if your family is connected to these farm worker families in Eastern Washington, could you please honor them by stating their last name in the chat? These were families that have been living here for generations and generations. They established their families. They stopped going back to Texas and California and their homes and took a chance on Washington because they found a place of belonging. So in the chat, could you please add the last names of your families that you are connected to? Andres Garcia, neighbors, and our families worked many years together. Gonzalez, yes, there are many families that traveled and worked together. Thank you for that. The Antu family, Lopez, Gonzalez. I can think of in Granger, the Solises and the Cantus and the Castros, and in Sunnyside, the Hernandezes and the Esquedas and the Casas and the Martinezes. So many families that are still living here today that are part of this heritage of Eastern Washington farm workers. And here they are cutting asparagus is Andres Garcia. This one's in 1971 out of Granger. Many of them came with the Bracero program. A lot of the pictures where you see men only, I'm assuming that they're from the Bracero program. But then we also have families. So I love this picture where I assume it's like mom and dad and kids, because we all did it together. As being raised in farm work, we all went together. Mom would make burritos in the morning, and then the whole family ended up worked in the fields together. And here, just women and the strength and resilience of women. This is a quote from Laura Solis, who really is the one who gets credit for this community on Facebook, because she spotted I believe it's her grandmother. It might be her great aunt, but I believe it's her grandmother. She said, the strength of the community is in these photographs. This isn't just an issue that is in the past. I think it is an issue that is still relevant today. And I don't see a farm worker. I see a skilled, strong, loving, beautiful, Mexicana, Chicana woman supporting her family and working hard. And, we don't even know what else she has to do for the day. But and her name is Alicia Elizondo, cutting asparagus in Granger. And it was hard work. They had to bend over to cut the asparagus. Let me know if you've cut asparagus before. Go ahead and put that in the chat. With a cuchillo. I had not cut asparagus before. I used to work in the beet fields of Idaho. And we hoed beets. We didn't cut by bending over. And then the hop harvest in Granger, also men and women working alongside each other, still happening today. I have friends on TikTok that post their videos working out in the hop fields. The smell of the asparagus took forever to come out of your hands. Thank you, Gustavo. Men and women working alongside each other in beloved community. I love these pictures of our families. This is a picture at a farm worker union meeting at the Sunnyside Park. Who takes the entire family to a farm worker union meeting? We do. The entire family's there. Abuelo and tias and tios and kids and abuelas. And I love just the smiles on their faces. It's like a genuine community of belonging. I love just the smile on this abuelo's face of just peace. Even though we're fighting for our rights and we're being mistreated, when we're together, there's joy and there's peace in the community. Picking strawberries, yes. Cutting asparagus with my best friend at 13. We decided to try and drive her dad's truck and didn't get out of the driveway before we crashed the truck. Oh my goodness, her family cut asparagus and we had to go help pay for the truck repairs. Yes, unskilled labor is such a lie. It takes so much skill. And his name is, I thought I had it, Martin Yanes Sr. So if anybody's related to the Yanes family, that name's also familiar. The two of the gals in the picture are Connie Beltran and Simona Beltran, who are sisters. And I just love the naturalness of the family. This is a picture in Sunnyside. Those of you who live in Sunnyside, have been to Sunnyside, can recognize this hill with the water tower. This is the Garcia family in 1978. And another thing that Nash said was, it was always about people. Maybe that's what I love about his photographs, is that you can tell that he wasn't just taking pictures like, for some magazine or something to show migrant farm labor at work, but it really was to highlight the beauty of the people. And this is the Garcia family, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So I'm going to point out Juan Garcia on the top left, which I'm going to talk about later. And this is, I believe, Albert Garcia's family. And their kids have come, they're principals, and they still live up here. One of the Garcias lived here by the water tower. Another one lives over here on the left. And I actually live over here on the left too. So I just love that. Another thing that our community did is we created an escuelita. We saw that our next generation needed to have pride in our community, because we internalized the racism. We internalized, when we were talking about being ashamed of our skin color, we internalized that. And so our community was very intentional of creating this La Escuelita Cultural Center in Granger, founded in 1969 by University of Washington students, the importance of young people in the movement, and established to foster positive Chicano self-image, teach Mexican-American history, and preserve culture through Spanish language and games and folk dancing. During the Chicano civil rights movement of the 60s, Mexican-Americans in the Columbia River Basin recognized a deep need to preserve heritage. And Granger was an epicenter of the agricultural labor, and the area's Chicano residents faced heavy economic and political marginalization. So activists, including Tomás Villanueva and Emilio Aguayo, started the Escuelita, which ended up, I looked it up to see if it was still around or where it was located. It was eventually closed because of the opening of Radio Cadena, but which I think is really sad, because I still think that we need these places to teach our children our heritage and preserve our culture. But also, and this is teacher Mrs. Zoila Lemos is the teacher, and the student is Oralia Cantu. Just love the smiling and the matete. She's showing her how to crush corn. I've never even done that. And solo el pueblo sana al pueblo. Solo el pueblo salva al pueblo. The beginning of, this was the beginning before Yakima Valley's Farmworkers Clinic. Mobile clinics and early farm worker health centers in the 70s started as grassroots civil rights initiatives, born out of necessity, because our migrant and seasonal agricultural workers had no access to healthcare. They lived in these remote areas. The unions and the activists and community groups all banded together and said we need to do something, and created these mobile units, improvised mobile units, who later ended up becoming Farmworkers Clinic. Also took dental care to the schools. Farm workers were because they were shut out of the healthcare system, they needed dental care. And so mobile units that went out to the schools to provide learning dental hygiene to the schools of the Valley by student VISTA volunteers. And then you can't talk about our community without talking about the importance of language and music and radio. This is Herminia Mendez, entrepreneur, developed and hosted the first Spanish language radio broadcast in the Pacific Northwest. Has a place in my heart because she's my tocaya with my first name, but also she's an entrepreneur and knew the importance of music and information for our community. And at that time, a lot of the public areas or events, even some of the Catholic churches, would not let us have Spanish-speaking events in their venues. So what does Herminia Mendez do? She purchases a dance and event hall. First, El Baile Grande in Sunnyside, and then later with her son, Paul Mendez, La Tropicana. She brought in Tejano musicians, and as far as I'm aware, she brought in Ramon Ayala, and she brought in Los Tigres del Norte. I believe this is the reason that our families stayed in Eastern Washington. They found spaces of belonging and spaces of community where they could speak their language. They had ways of communicating to each other, important events like the radio. They bound together and worked together to protect their community, to be there for health and purposes, dental purposes, to boycott and protest together, and found strength in community, which I think is just beautiful. And this information is, I'm grateful to Erasmo Gamboa, who is a professor, historian at University of Washington, who gathered this information. And then music. The anthem of the farm worker movement. Many of you may have heard the song, and maybe you didn't know that it was the anthem of the farm worker movement, De Colores. Music was the lifeblood of the Delano grape strike, and acted as a powerful tool to unite Mexican and Filipino farm workers. Again, all of our communities need to work together to boost morale on the picket lines and draw national sympathy during the movement. But then it remained the anthem. They used to sing it at the union meetings, at protest lines, and I learned it as a child in Texas. And for those who the name sounds familiar, my music teacher was Roberto Pulido in Texas, where I learned both De Colores. I don't know why I remember this. This is my core memory. De Colores and Yankee Doodle Dandy were taught to me by Roberto Pulido in Alamo, Texas Elementary School. And you know why they started Radio Cadena, the voice of the farm worker. With the aid of staff and volunteers, they opened in December of 1979 to bring the struggle for farm worker justice and social equity to the airwaves. La Voz del Campesino, they are still in Granger today, providing Latino and other minorities an avenue for communication. And let's not forget the importance of our faith communities. Whether that brings back trauma, I acknowledge, but also acknowledge the place that faith communities had for us. Whether it was a Protestant church like this picture here, and I don't remember where I got this picture. This is where I got married. I think my husband is in this picture. I have not been able to find him because I located his parents in this picture. These families lived together, worked together, worshiped together in their own languages, ate together, fellowshiped together, eating tamales and enchiladas and pozole after church at events, having gatherings like bodas and quinceañeras and posadas together. I again believe these were the reasons that families stayed, because they found community and they found belonging in their Protestant Baptist churches and Assembly of God churches, but also in the Catholic Church. St. Joseph's in Sunnyside played a big part in all of these families. Weddings and baptisms and funerals, places where we gather together still today as a community. And I believe this picture on the top left is actually from St. Joseph. This is Cecilia Villanueva, quinceañera, with her mother, Maria Elena Treviño Villanueva. And on the top right, the two people pictured that got married are actually from that church in the previous slide. Abel Moya and Juanita Chavez, wedding in Sunnyside. La cultura cura. That's what creates belonging. And then, because music is so important, this one isn't at the Tropicana, but it's in Toppenish. The other venue that they had was La Puerta Negra in Toppenish. This is Alejandro Rodriguez and Los Brillantes playing Tejano music. And then just I was hoping to have more time for you to have conversation with me. So I've been talking this whole time, but I'm just going to quickly go through how my story connects to the story of Eastern Washington, even though I wasn't raised here. This is a picture of my great-grandma. This is the only picture I have of a great-grandparent. She's with my grandmother in this picture. just reminds me of my roots. Many of us don't have those memories and those pictures. The picture of both of sets of grandparents, that again reminds me of our indigenous roots, and how clearly I see our indigenous heritage, and especially my grandmothers, both of my grandmothers, but yet don't know what tribal connections I have, or what indigenous languages are part of our community, because that was erased. And acknowledging that none of us picked ourselves from our bootstraps to get here. All of us are products of our communities and the hard work and advocacy that our families, and paths that our families created for us. And I just think of my mom, and grateful to all of the women in our families, such strong women who not only had to work in the fields, but raised the children, the primary role in raising our children, making food for us before school, sending us off to school, parent-teacher conferences as best they could when they could attend, really just being the matriarchs in our families, and carrying the weight and the load of what's happened. A reminder of my own background, of us having to live in two worlds, those of us who are bilingual and bicultural. When my parents decided to stay in Idaho, my cousins returned back when we were farm workers to Idaho. They kept coming every summer from Texas to Idaho. We stayed. And so I was the only Latina in my class in 6th grade in Idaho during the day, but yet got to go back to the labor camp after school and spend time with my cousins and my family, which was really home for me. And having to adjust to that dual life and dual language and two cultures, which I now appreciate today, because I believe that's what makes us so flexible and adaptable in navigating our different spaces. Having quinceañeras on one hand, and also being on the drill team in the 4th of July parade on the other. Again, navigating these two worlds, and pressure from both worlds to assimilate to one and to keep the culture in the other. And having my friends that had those lived experiences, that also had that farm worker history and families, and also finding new spaces of community. I was a nerd, so I was part of the math club and the calculus class, and found community there, because there weren't very many nerds that liked calculus at that during that time. And then going to college and wanting to still stay connected to my community, which is hard to do at the University of Idaho. But luckily, my roommate, I don't even remember how we met, was a professional ballet folklorico dancer. And I belonged to Mecha at Washington State University, even though I was going to school at the University of Idaho. We would drive those 8 miles to Pullman and participate in baile folklorico. And because I love dance so much, was also part of the University of Idaho dance team. Again, navigating those two worlds, wanting to be part of both, not wanting to forget where I came from, and still longing for it as being one of the only Latinas on campus. And then knowing that it's our responsibility to pass this on to the next generation, and learning from the next generation. My son got his master's, my daughter got her master's, and then my granddaughter got her doctorate. Aquí estamos y no nos vamos, which motivated me to go get my master's to pass on to the next generation, our youngest granddaughter. And we're doing well. And I wanted to, this is our heritage. Lorraine, you're part of our heritage. Juan Garza is part of our heritage. We are scholars. We are entrepreneurs. We have trades. We have graduate degrees. We're teachers. Sorry for talking so fast. Principals, administrators, nurses, doctors, state employees, city officials, attorneys. My son works for city government in California. Here's Vicky, our first Latina mayor in Sunnyside after all these years. Marthy, my daughter's best friend, who is a Gates scholar and attorney specializing in tribal law. And my niece, who is a vice principal with her Golden Apple Award. And then remember Juan Garcia that I showed you before? Over Memorial Day weekend at the John Wayne's Airport in California, I ran into his daughter, Felicia, who told me that her daughter was graduating this year with a full ride academic and sports scholarship. Here she is making 1,000 points for the Grizzlies and now has a full ride next year. This is the product of all of this work and all of these families that sacrifice so much that still live here in the Valley. Because I still believe in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that includes every single person in our community. So I'm going to ask Lorraine to come on, and I wanted to finish this. Remember, we talked about de colores, and so Lorraine is going to tell us what we're going to listen to next.
Thank you, Herminia. We're showing a video of me and my dad singing de colores, and we heard from Herminia about the importance of that song in the farm worker movement. But also I want to just share briefly that I am here today because of the farm worker movement. My grandpa migrated to Sunnyside back in the 70s, I believe, brought my mom. She was just about 2-3 years old when he did. My dad migrated probably around the 80s or so. He migrated alone with the intention of coming to work the fields, making tons of money, he said, and then going back to Mexico. But he stayed, he found community, he met my mom, he fell in love, and stayed. And so we prepared this little song, and we're going to play it for you all. Hola, mi nombre es Lorraine y aquí estoy con mi papá Elías, que está tocando la guitarra. Les vamos a cantar un canto que se titula De Colores.